was about, I suppose you could say, a little bit of Hegelian, a little bit of Nietzschean metaphysics. We've also discussed Lacan's sexual non-relationship in an evolutionary context, and also had him on my channel once with his collaborator Bruce Alderman to discuss religion and lack. So welcome back to the channel, Layman, and really excited to have you on here. This is a part of a larger discussion series called the Nietzsche Dialogues. And the aim of the Nietzsche Dialogues is really to open up Nietzsche to, let's say, like the most important topics that I think we can discuss regarding Nietzsche in the 21st century. We've already discussed Nietzsche and Christianity. And in the future, we're going to be discussing Nietzsche and conflict, Nietzsche and nihilism, postmodernism, Nietzsche and women, the future of Nietzsche. But today we're here to discuss Layman Pascal's Nietzsche, to say like his own idiosyncratic interpretation of Nietzsche. And this is, I think, in a long tradition of philosophy that has proven very fruitful to engage in idiosyncratic interpretation of Nietzsche. Nietzsche has been extremely impactful when it comes to theory of psychoanalysis, social theory, theology, New Age spirituality, poetry, literature, art, even cosmology and evolutionary theory. So the influence of Nietzsche is enormous, to say the least, and it seems like a very fruitful philosopher to engage in unique interpretive speculation, let's say. So that's I think enough of an introduction. Layman, welcome to my channel, and really excited for this conversation. So
yeah, me too. Thanks for having me here. I love going deep with Nietzsche, who's I think still one of our most underutilized human treasures. And happy to be with a proud Ontarian and a guy who, in my opinion, is one of today's real philosophers, Cadell.
Well, thanks. And I guess in that context, a couple of Ontario philosophers. I think my real first sort of deep engagement with Nietzsche came sort of stimulated in part by Jordan Peterson as a psychologist who used Nietzsche and has his own interpretation of Nietzsche, and it sort of it for me, it immediately signaled the connection in my mind between Nietzsche's, let's say, productive use at the edges of evolutionary psychology and trying to sort of basically come up with an interpretation of evolutionary theory, which includes sort of some deep philosophical metaphysical engagement. Maybe when it comes to your own idiosyncratic interpretation of Nietzsche, where did you start? Where did you first sort of become inspired, let's say, to engage Nietzsche, and what was your main motivations?
Yeah, I started probably seriously in high school, although I was aware of him as a reference that other interesting people used. They were clearly pointing at some peculiarity within the field of philosophy. But it wasn't until I got a great beaten up old copy of Beyond Good and Evil at a thrift store in grade 9 or 10 that I started to really delve into it, struck by his style first. And then as I sort of aged with those ideas in me, they started to become pertinent. I would look around and go, oh, this is the nihilism thing he was talking about, or oh, this is the social distinction he was pointing at. And then I began to just reread him personally, which is why it becomes idiosyncratic, essentially, is that I'm putting the vast majority of my energy into rereading and looking for points of connection that surprise me in the text. And I'm trying to put aside everything I think people think about Nietzsche in order to find out what I want Nietzsche to be. Although there were a couple of, I love Deleuze's take. There's things I love about Heidegger's take. I read a great biography of him called Composing the Soul, where each chapter followed one metaphoric theme through his whole life's work, like plants in Nietzsche and animals in Nietzsche, music in Nietzsche. Fantastic text. I think if people haven't read Julian Jung's Nietzsche and the Philosophy of Religion, they probably should, because Julian's take is worth having in the mix. His argument that Nietzsche is basically a religious communitarian thinker, is an excellent counterweight to some of the other takes on it. So those have been some of my favorite external sources, but mostly what I've done is just come back to him again and again, never trust that I know what he's trying to say already, and try to weave in any other thought systems I like and try to see if there are contact points or if there's any plausible way of saying that he was saying what they're saying as well. There's a constant churning and a constant synthesizing effort.
I love like the first thing that stands out to me there in your reflection is sort of the humbleness. And this is actually, I mean, I think I like this because it's kind of how I was sort of mentally operating when I started reading Hegel, but it's sort of this approaching a great philosophical thinker with an extreme humbleness, sort of like, whenever I come back to them, never trusting that I fully understand him, basically sort of assuming a lack in myself, as opposed to sort of trying to read, I suppose, with a critical mind. But how has this sort of radical open-mindedness and sort of I guess a willingness to submit to Nietzsche's style and mind, and sort of never really sort of feeling like you fully grasped him, how has that sort of helped the development of your mind, let's say, like, or how has that sort of engaged the rest of your philosophical adventure?
Yeah, I've treated him a bit like koans, right? Like it's a gymnasium that you keep going back to. And then when you treat people like that, some people eventually you go, all right, I've used this up. This thinker has nothing else to tell me. But Nietzsche is dense enough and complex enough that there's almost always something in there. I think some of the main influences in my thinking have been to really switch from witnessing to appetition as the notion of what the subjective correlate of objective experience is. Right. So if you come at this through kind of a classical spiritual philosopher lens, right, maybe epitomized in the last couple of decades by Ken Wilber, you get this notion that there's some kind of subjectivity that's always accompanying objectivity in some form, right? Not that they're fundamentally dualist in a Cartesian way, but there's always something like a subjective component to experience. But when people come at it through a very cold philosophical lens, or sometimes through particular Eastern styles of meditation, they get the assumption that consciousness is the right description for that, or that I'm just the abstract observer awareness of reality. And I think what Nietzsche points to is that you take the subjective experience all the way down the stack, and what you find is it's more like an urge than it is like a watcher. That what we call consciousness is a tiny, almost insignificant component of the general subjective character of reality, which is what he wants to point at with this will to power description.
That's really amazing, and I think, like, for me, the reason why the way you're describing that is amazing is because, as you know, I've also sort of been strongly influenced by Freud, and I'd be interested, in so far as we can, touch on the way in which perhaps Nietzsche influenced Freud, or psychoanalysis perhaps picked up some ideas that were already there in Nietzsche. But one of the ideas I really like in Freud's writings is he makes this distinction between consciousness and the psyche, where he says psychology has assumed that psyche is equal to consciousness, where in actuality, consciousness is actually a small part of the psyche, where he's investigating the unconscious with urges. And then you're making this connection as well, that consciousness is actually a small part of the equation, and that when you go all the way down, what you're dealing with is urges. And I think that the term that comes up in Freud's writing is drives. And if we could equate urges and drives, instincts a little bit, one of the notions that has always stuck in my mind when I read Nietzsche was, he was saying, when you read, and maybe we can connect this to how you read Nietzsche, but Nietzsche says, when you read a text, you should read it with the same urge or drive that a lion chases a gazelle, like a hungry lion chases a gazelle. In other words, you should be hungry when you're reading it. And if you're not hungry, when you're reading, are you really learning? Or he gives this idea that the scholars or the intellectuals, generally speaking, are not really hungry. They're kind of like dead, like they're kind of severed from, what he calls the will to power and the will to truth. He says, my will to power is on the heels of your will to truth. And it gives the sort of the idea that, your will to truth is fake, and this type of thing. So, maybe I could lead that into a segue of when you're reading Nietzsche, and with this sort of emphasis on urge, does there any resonance with this idea of a drive or a hunger or I know when I'm reading philosophical texts, this is very relevant to how I'm sort of mentally operating.
I think I would come to two things with that. The first is you have an attitudinal choice to some degree when you're reading a text of what energy you want to bring to it and which aspects of the writer you want to resonate with. And I think Nietzsche calls us toward a more appetite-like, a more driven, a more energetic approach, which is really unifying because it situates our values and what we're trying to do, even with consciousness, situates it back in the entire spectrum of the rest of the universe, which is this amazing place of drives and forces and energies and collisions and enfoldments. So there's that. The choice to lean into that is important, and Nietzsche constantly calls us to that. Right, one of his early papers on the use and abuse of history for life really points out this sense of the danger of reading things in a neutral sense. Now, there's a utility to that, right? Sloterdijk's ascesis points to the kind of interesting insights and empowerment you can get through the exercise of being as if you were the disembodied watcher. But for most of us, he's pointing to something about the way health and the way values and the way meaning and the way transformation are generated by dynamic urgencies within the being. And we have to encounter them and sympathize with them in order to start to be able to integrate and organize them in a way that's effective for us. And then the other part of that is, I think, this enormous emphasis on health, right? You see some aspects of Nietzsche show up in Freud, but you also see some aspects of Nietzsche show up in a guy like Wilhelm Reich, where we're going to say, look, there's things about the world you just can't understand unless there's a really intense free flow of stimulation currents through your physiology. Unless you are healthy enough to be excited, to be turned on, to feel your body tingling and pulsing and being thirsty for life and desiring things, there's aspects of reality you can't understand unless your nervous system is informed by those flows of excitement. And so I think one of the things Nietzsche is doing is calling the reader to favor the risk of being healthy, of allowing stimulating flows to move through them and allowing that to be the primary tool we use for investigating reality, with objective truth and consciousness as an assistant or secondary to that process.
Okay, so one of the things that in some sense confuses me a little bit is the way in which, again, we're generalizing, but the way in which oftentimes, let's say intellectuals or scholars makes this distinction between being in a mode of being alive, desiring things, being healthy, stimulating flows, and so forth, as a part of the very activity of learning, versus, say, objective knowledge and truth. Where objective knowledge and truth are somehow not desiring things and not, so as it were, in the flow and a part of the thing in itself. There's this way in which there's let's say this desire for a type of disembodied witnessing neutrality. And I do think, like in sort of my own reading of Nietzsche, I think there's no way in which Nietzsche would support any notion of truth or objectivity which severed itself from this being thirsty for life and desiring things. If anything, I get this idea that the being thirsty for life and desiring things is somehow entangled with truth and whatever we might want to call objectivity. So I guess my question to you is, why do you think perhaps we get so biased, both in the scientific frame of mind, I think, and perhaps also, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps also in the sort of more meditative, contemplative traditions, spiritual traditions? Why do we try to associate objectivity and truth with, like we said, the opposite of being really involved and alive and desiring and so forth?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and I think there are different answers for different groups of people, right? If you read the essay on ascetic practice in Genealogy of Morals, he makes it very clear that the significance of ascetic practice is going to be different for different groups, right? For some people, it might be a way of resting up to get more charge later. For some people, it's a way of securing the space in which they can demonstrate their own empowerment most thoroughly. That's what he says when the philosopher does it. It's to give himself space from the rest of life so he can pursue a certain channel of growth and empowerment. But for other people, it might be a sign of pathology, right? That would bring in that Reichian perspective again, is that people are either traumatized or resistant to the intensity of the flows in themselves. And in trying to negate those troubling intensities, which might be troubling for very sensible reasons, they nonetheless have to lower the volume on that experience, lock it down under muscle armoring, under life habits, and things like that. That's one of the areas where it feeds into traditional religious discussions as well, because very often one of the things religion is pointing you towards, not for everybody all the time, but for special people some of the time, is to have eruptions of experience that go beyond the thermostat that keeps your internal experience of intensity in check. And so I think we're all kind of doing that. And especially if you get involved in an institution where everybody prides themselves on doing that to some degree and reflects a broader social power structure that's invested in pretending that what it wants is the objective truth, then you have a situation in which it's very hard for a lot of people to find their way back to that. But on the other hand, therapy, different kinds of child raising, different kinds of chemicals, different kinds of inner experience are constantly opening those areas back up for us.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, I get this idea that the separation of a very intense mode of being versus, let's say, a neutral distance mode of being can have a sort of pragmatic utility, that you can't be intense all the time. On the other, and it can be also a sort of storing up and a sort of saving your intensity for the right moment. And then there can also be sort of the situation where, there can be just institutional constraints that make it problematic to be at that high level of intensity all the time. Maybe that segues into anything else you want to add about how does this general distinction inform the way you read Nietzsche, or the way you think we should read Nietzsche?
Well, I think we need to, he's so focused on a return to the body, as it says so clearly in the introduction to Zarathustra, that we should, like good post 20th century somatic therapy participants, understand that we have to read it with our physiology, right? That the pulse and the tempo and the energy and what goes on in the streamings of your body, that this is what's being pointed at with notions of energy and notions of the will to power and self-overcoming and struggle, that these are not purely abstract concepts that a historian of philosophy could go through and mark it off on the chart. These are really pulsating, living, exciting things. And if you can't find the thread, the stream of excitement that's moving through his words, then you won't really be able to orient yourself toward what he's trying to say, right? And maybe there's a chance here for me to say a couple of things about what I think are best practices in terms of reading Nietzsche, because there's a couple of strategies that inform my approach anyway. And I think one of the main things is obviously this notion that this isn't for everybody. He's very clear all the time. I'm not writing for all readers. And that also means that most university professors are the wrong people, right? So when you're reading it, you have to take seriously the question whether or not you're one of the correct readers. whether you fall into that special group. So just, maybe you do. Often people who are attracted to it may be in that group. But stay aware that this is not necessarily for you and certainly not for everyone. It's not a general statement of his feelings that everyone is supposed to be able to read and then know. It's not that kind of text. I think secondly is he lays landmines, is how I think about it, to drive off the wrong people. And these landmines consist of using unnecessarily charged associations with terminology. So the reader has to constantly clean their own ears, right? If he says slave or herd or antichrist or woman, right, there's an easy tendency to lean into conventional social valences that we associate with these charged terms. But I don't think you're reading Nietzsche unless you've separated the concept from the charged social valences. This is one of the tests to drive off the wrong people. If you go for the standard valences, whether pejorative or idealized, with certain words, he's tricked you into a cul-de-sac, and now you're no longer figuring out what he's saying. So this is one of the filtering mechanisms to call out the correct readers. I think the third thing is what he says so often: tempo is as or more important than the content of the statements. That's what he believes when he reads things, and that's what he wants us to understand. He asks us to listen with the third ear, he calls it, right? And especially after Zarathustra transforms him, what I hear in these latter books is this golden sound, the halcyon sound. I think of him as Groucho Marx sword fighting Errol Flynn. I hear notes of the blues. I hear this African beat transforming European music that he wants to point to when he affirms Bizet over Wagner for health and philosophical reasons. So this sense of really leaning into the music of the text and not just noting that that's an interesting feature, but holding that co-equal or even superior to what you think the content of the propositional statements are. That's important. And then the fourth thing is, when you read segments of Nietzsche, you're never getting his vision. You're never getting his big picture. He goes into instances. He'll pick up a perspective tunnel and go as deep as he can, explore as far as he can dare, come back, repackage that, and present it. But in none of those statements, in none of those little pieces, are you ever going to get his vision. He's deliberately holding that back, and you have to piece it together. So I would say try to read each little instance of Nietzsche's writing from the background of everything else you've heard him say, so that we don't get lost in trying to evaluate what one particular chunk is like. Well, those are my four general strategies for reading Nietzsche.
It's amazing. And just for the listeners, just to maybe summarize some of those, we correct me if I am missing any of them here. We've got sort of this emphasis on reading from the perspective of the body, really an embodied reading, a physiological reading, which I think is perhaps connected to what you were emphasizing at the start of our conversation about emphasizing this almost, maybe I would call it an unconscious drive. You emphasize the urge in there, that Nietzsche isn't writing for everybody, that there's a certain small group. And I guess on that note, there might be something you might want to tease out a little bit, because one of the things I always hear people criticize is that there's young guys in their 20s are attracted to Nietzsche. Should young guys in their 20s be reading Nietzsche? Is that the group he's specifically targeting? Because I've heard a lot of people sort of say something along the lines of what you said, which is that I read Nietzsche when I was young, and I didn't necessarily understand exactly what I was getting myself into, but his ideas grew with me. And then I revisited Nietzsche. And I think that can be actually quite beneficial, like that, if you're 20, you're reading Nietzsche, you might not really get what he's saying, but nonetheless, the ideas will grow with you. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. I mean, there's, outside of how you approach Nietzsche, there's how you approach writing in general, right? So from my point of view, rereading is much more important than reading, right? You don't know what it says having read through it yet. And if it's complex material, rereading depth is what counts, not knowing the categories of content you associate with the text. And then the other point is digest what you bite off, right? If you're reading Nietzsche and you come across a sentence and he's packed so much into it, and you go, wow, that I feel something there and I'm not sure what it is, stop reading. Don't go on to the next section. Chew that thing up until it's a part of you.
Yeah,
That's
go
how
on a
you
walk with it.
any text.
Yeah. I just say go on a walk with it. Like there are some statements. I'm just because the Thus Spoke Zarathustra so fresh in my mind. There are so many statements that come like bolts of lightning at you, where you could sit with it for the rest of the day, just a few sentences, but yeah, just go for a walk when you're reading Nietzsche afterwards. I
Then
think
you
that
notice things you weren't picking up, and you also are available because if you shift moods while you're pondering, you become available to different affects in the text, right? Like Nietzsche is full of jokes. And if you're not noticing that, then you're not reading it correctly. If you think it, they used to use these pictures of like the romantic guy on the mountains staring at the cold German mist on these covers of Nietzsche books. That couldn't be farther from the tone he keeps referring to and trying to generate this laughing, bouncing, dancing, golden, overflowing thing he keeps talking about. And we're like, ah, yes, a dour, individualistic, lonely wanderer, right? It takes time and different modes of being to figure out what the tone of the text is. And if you don't get the tone, if you don't hear the jokes, you're not really reading it yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'm maybe a little bit guilty for using that imagery as well. But it's the only imagery that you find online in terms of like when you search Nietzsche's Zarathustra or the Overman, those are the images that come up. But I'd like to actually maybe stay on that point a little bit, because I think it's worth unpacking a little bit. Is that one thing that does come through so clearly in the text is what you just said of he says almost like you should overcome yourself with laughter constantly, like constantly laugh over yourself, and of course dancing and this emphasis on sort of the aloneness. I always get the sense that the aloneness has the function of also cultivating specifically an overflowingness. And so you do get this idea of a hyper energetic individual, almost like an individual that has so much energy that it can't contain, that he can't contain himself. And that's the reason for his socializing, not loneliness. Why do you think there is this sort of connection with Nietzsche as like you say, a dour, individualistic, lonely? I mean, the theme, I will say that the theme of lonely wandering is also there in Nietzsche, but you might want to speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, loneliness is an ambiguous term. It can go in a number of different directions. There's the loneliness of the spiritual practice and of the philosophic hermit. And that loneliness is part of the necessary conditions for them to thrive and deepen and access these currents in themselves that can then be woven together and produce some kind of excessive, overflowing experience that we'll point to as spiritual success. So there's a real functional aspect to it, but we also don't want to overlook that the human being Nietzsche was very lonely, right? This is not a guy with pets or girlfriends or an extended family or a tribe he can get along with. He's desperately calling out to these readers in the future who don't exist yet.
Yeah.
Right? So emotionally, as a man, he's very lonely. But that doesn't mean that that's all that the term loneliness is pointing to. It also has all these other dimensions of amplified, coherent, subjective intensity.
Well, on that point, like another thinker that I've been very influenced by is, I think you might be aware, is Osho, and Osho, I think, has stated explicitly, and I think in my studying Osho, I think also implicitly he's extraordinarily influenced by Nietzsche, and he's stated explicitly the influence of Nietzsche. But what I want to highlight specifically as it relates to the concept of loneliness is that Osho talked about going from loneliness to aloneness, and that aloneness is not how we generally associate with the meaning of loneliness. He sees aloneness as a very emancipatory spaciousness, and also pointing towards overflowingness. So what I want to say here is, what I get when I read Nietzsche is reclaiming the notion of lonely. as an actually an empowering term, say aloneness. We could use a different word, but to reclaim loneliness, to reclaim being alone.
Yeah, there's a role for it, and
Yeah.
it's the pathos bothers us because of the emotional intensity involved in the pang of loneliness, and also the social fear of being isolated from our support systems in relationship. That's frightening. But classically, human beings that wanted depth periodically entered into spaces where they were productively alone. And that productivity, it did involve a sense of emotional risk. They're risking loneliness, but they're trying to get the aloneness where they can become more authentically and completely and even excessively who they are. And then that energy will bring you back to the people, which is, of course, that's the setup for the plot of Zarathustra.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, this is just coming to my mind. I wonder if we could riff a little bit on a distinction that comes up for me very profoundly in Zarathustra, is the distinction between the neighbor and the friend. And I get the idea that the neighbor is almost someone that people are interacting with because they want to avoid being alone. Whereas, and you can only show partial truths and little bits of yourself here and there. It's not really too deep. It's very surface level interaction. Whereas the friend is someone who bestows a whole world, and is again this notion of an overflowingness, and maybe that's also like an interesting distinction to deepen.
Yeah, it's different kinds of relationships are pointed to. If you come at it from a developmental psychology stage, then you would assume different worldviews, different sense of self, different kinds of relational flavors emerge in these different moments of maturation as a human being. But I remember my dad, who was in Turkey and Istanbul and places like that in the 60s, would tell me stories about the people he was connected to, even though he couldn't speak their language, right? The one guy who comes out of the crowd to help you in a foreign land. It's a very interesting form of, oh, he's not my neighbor. He's my friend in some way, right? Ivan Illich points to this in his interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The way he takes that is Jesus tells this story, and the story consists of a man needs help, and nobody in his family helps him, and nobody in his religion helps him, and nobody in his town helps him. And the only person who helps him is a member of a hated other tribe who just spontaneously resonates with this particular guy and then looks after him. Right? We could imagine it as the tale of the good Satanist today, or the tale of the good jihadist, or something like that. Right? That there's a connection that's possible outside of the whole panoply of normal social proximities, and that's the one that's most worth having, especially if you are a philosopher or a mystic mutant trainee or any of those kinds of people, because you're looking for new kinds of relating that empower your strange subcultural event that you're trying to generate in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe on that point, we could sort of go in the direction of something I'm perhaps I couldn't really ask this question to anyone else, or anyone better in any case. Is you're someone in your weird mutant spiritual tribe is someone who, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is associated with integral theory, and various and of course your YouTube channel is called The Integral State. So the question I would want to ask you is, what's the connection in your mind between Nietzsche and integral theory? I know you've already mentioned Ken Wilber, who's perhaps the pioneer of integral theory, and also the notion of, let's say, integral theory and the post-metaphysical, because we all know that Nietzsche's often sort of at least interpreted as someone being post-metaphysical, let's say. So what do these connections come into your mind?
Sure. And you mentioned Nietzsche as a strong source of inspiration for Osho, which is true. And I think we see a lot of interesting 20th century characters outside of the mainstream philosophical discourse, where people are like, oh, Freud and Foucault and Heidegger, right? Like, that's a couple of people influenced by him, but Adida and many of the Gurdjieffians via Ouspensky's love of Nietzsche, and Aurobindo probably would not have had his evolutionary integrative yoga had he not been so interested in Nietzsche. And that's one of the areas, or Bindo, but also Adida, that feeds in, and Maslow feeds into Ken Wilber's work. And Ken Wilber's, and also Whitehead, let's say, as a very good embodied Nietzschean. So Ken Wilber's trying to build up this model, and I think in Nietzsche's terms, this might be one of the commanding philosophers, right? This guy's like, here's my huge vision for how to improve planetary civilization, right? Nietzsche respects that move. Wilber's a bit like trying to be he always like, is he the Einstein of consciousness? And maybe he's the Napoleon of consciousness in some sense. But it's not really that important, Ken Wilber. What's important is that there's a general set of meta ideas of how we go past pluralistic, nihilistic, relativistic culture to establish something that takes the present world moment and all of spiritual and philosophical success history into account to produce it in a new way. And one of the ways that was at the leading edge of Wilber's thought that Bruce Alderman and I and several other people put a lot of work into was this notion of the integral post-metaphysical spirituality, right? It's integral because it takes plurality into account, but doesn't stay with the limits of plurality, tries to build something with them that usually requires a developmental or emergent context, or at least a notion of different maturational phases and different moments of history. It's spiritual in the sense that it's looking for those dimensions of spiritual thought that can actually transform people on the inside, cause them to move toward overflowing experience of being rather than deficiency experiences of being. And it's post-metaphysical in the sense that it's looking to operate outside or after traditional and modern metaphysics, right? So there's no post-metaphysics in the sense of being no metaphysics at all. It's the attempt to be post-metaphysical is to say, what kind of stripped down minimal metaphysics can we use that escapes from the modernist paradigm, escapes from the dogmatic pre-modern paradigm, and gives us the underlying structure that the postmodernists are using to bring forward their relativity and deconstruction with, but uses that instead as an ordering principle to start building up a new metaphysics that has all of the successful modes of spiritual and religious history and social formation history within its purview. So we worked on this for a while. There was an issue of the Integral Review magazine that was devoted to this, and in that magazine I wrote my Zarathustra as the first integral post-metaphysical hero, because I think in Western literature, Nietzsche's Zarathustra is the first post-metaphysical spiritual protagonist, right? He's the one who is accomplishing what all spirituality is pointing towards, but saying you don't need the classic degenerate notion of God. You don't need the normal conventional social mythology. You don't need any of the particular inherited belief structures to do this. Now, he's not necessarily saying that's true for everyone, but he's saying that is a real possibility. When Zarathustra awakens, he's overflowing. He says, I am like the sun now. I've really changed. I have more radiance than I can contain. I'd best go to the people. He goes down the hill. The first guy he meets is the religious, enlightened character. They recognize each other, right? They see it in their eyes that they've both done the same transformation. So they have a lot in common. They get along. This guy says, don't go tell it to the people. He's got experience in that regard. But when Zarathustra leaves, he says, can it be this man has not heard that God is dead? And what Zarathustra says in that moment is, look, I've done the thing, the religious transformation thing they were pointing to, but I didn't need their psychic or sociological structure. It's something different than that. It's a post-metaphysical, if you accept that terminology, transformative possibility.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you point to, I think, one of the, I mean, there are so many, of course, there are so many key relational interactions in Zarathustra, but nonetheless, this meeting between Zarathustra and the saint for this idea of the post-metaphysical is perhaps one of the most important. One of the things that the saint says, interestingly, is that I love animals and God, but not humans, and this is very, very interesting. That his love extends to everything, but the human, where Zarathustra is pointing towards not necessarily loving humans, but being in love around humans, or sort of being with love around humans. And at least the concept that sticks out to me is the imperfect. Because I think the saint says something like humans are too imperfect, and that this is fatal for me to be around imperfect humans. So the idea I'm getting at here with the idea of the post-metaphysical is it in some sense, and here I'm just sort of giving sort of maybe a little bit my own interpretation, but is the metaphysical, or the tendency towards the metaphysical in a strong sense, something to do with the negativity involved in dealing with the reality of other human beings, that we need a type of metaphysical scaffolding, you know, like if we're interacting with a common metaphysics, you know, and I wonder if this temptation could reemerge, that we always have to keep this sort of in mind, that the temptation to a type of strong metaphysics, even if we're saying we're not in a strong metaphysics, is always there as kind of like a defense against the imperfection of other humans. I don't know if this is too leading, but
no, that's a very interesting speculation, Cadell. And I think there are obviously some areas in which we would say that people need a strong metaphysics. Some people at some times require that, right? And one of the roles of the post-metaphysical or changed metaphysics people is to help generate a metaphysics for other people who aren't ready for that to live their lives. So part of it is just normal and healthy. Some people need a certain kind of metaphysical frame to hold them under certain conditions. On the other hand, clearly, interpersonal and intertribal antagonism is a real thing. Clearly, upset reactive chemistry is a real thing in animals like us. Clearly, there's a lot of feeling disgusted by and interrupted by other humans that everyone experiences, and most people try to suppress, and then some ideological commitment is valorized as part of that suppression and ignoring. Now, that may be the right move for certain people, but it's also worth exploring philosophically and even spiritually. And one of the things that's an underexplored narrative arc in Zarathustra is this question of basically misanthropy, right? Because the saint's like, hey, there's a problem with people. And Zarathustra's like, no, I'm going to go down to town and tell them, and it doesn't work. So he has a problem with that. And so he's like, I'm going to summon together a core group of apprentices and disciples. But it doesn't work either, because they're not individual enough, because they receive wisdom from him. So then he has to go on all these adventures with just like random exploratory individuals. And he gets to this point, and he's been considering the nausea you feel in the face of other people, that thing that makes even children go, oh, the dog died in the movie, when hundreds of members of your own species were just slaughtered and you felt nothing, but oh, the poor doggy, right? We have a lot of this nausea toward humanity, unless it's the humanity that's been specially, like, they're in our house, and even then we're mad at them sometimes, or they're in our community, okay. But in general, people, very disturbing and distressing and dangerous. But Zarathustra goes on a journey partly in himself to redeem that, right? It's at the beginning of this. Most stories end with the potential transformation of the individual. That's the modern narrative. The individual has their personal experience and explores it, and then they may become a transfigured individual. Zarathustra is already a transfigured individual at the beginning of the story. Partly what he does is go on a journey to become an intersubjective member of the human species, so he can have a productive relationship with these people that keep failing him, keep not understanding him, and keep triggering in him, as well as in the otherwise people, a sense of disgust. And he comes to this moment. Part of what the famous dream he has of the shepherd is that this is a moment where I think the insight into how you live as a human being and how you live with other human beings comes forward. It's like one of the peak moments in the story is the ongoing dilemma of the nausea of other people is somehow transformed in this dream. And he tells people the dream as a kind of coded message. Anyway, I think it's very interesting to think of that, the journey of the distress of others, as one of the narrative arcs within the Zarathustra canon.
Yeah, I agree that it's. I mean, perhaps it is an underexplored arc. It's now that I think about it, it's not something that I've heard a lot of people comment on. But it's sort of like what I would want to say is like what I would call like let's say an irreducible tension or an irreducible antagonism, just with that intersubjectivity is structured as such that there is, in other words, there is no intersubjectivity like a perfect intersubjectivity. There's no frictionless intersubjectivity. That intersubjectivity comes with a certain antagonism. And another concept related to, so I want to bring it back to your, sounds like your big project of what maybe we could call integral post metaphysical spirituality. When you said integral, you said not limited by plurality, but building with a sort of developmental emergentist concept. And in some of the philosophy I've studied, specifically what's coming to mind is Alenka Zupancic, is she emphasizes that, and like a concept of plurality without antagonism is what's the problem with postmodernism. So she'll emphasize that postmodernism emphasizes plurality, but it's a plurality sans antagonism. And so because it's a sort of plurality sans antagonism, we get sort of like this sort of pseudo multiplicity, or this multiplicity which doesn't really engage in the core, let's say, struggles of humanity. So how would, I guess my question here leading in would be, how does integral post-metaphysical spirituality deal with this? Or how do you relate to this relationship between plurality on the one hand, intersubjectivity, and antagonism, tension, and so forth?
Yeah, there's a number of different aspects to that. I mean, one thing is the, let's say, normal human capacity to be a contextually aware pluralistic cognizer. All right, we've seen that occur historically, but it's been promoted recently, and it didn't have to necessarily take the form it took. The form it's taken is partly a reaction to the deficiency modes of modernity, and so there's a thematic overcorrection that's possible. So I want to put that aside and just look more directly at how a plural psyche is itself insufficient, and what is required to take it to that next step. And that requirement is partly emotional and developmental, right? If you are raised without the ability to feel yourself up against a boundary, then you will constantly escape from boundaries into a kind of melted pluralism. And the experience of going between contexts and perspectives, which is a very important experience to have, becomes the whole reality. You never run into anything and you never take any position. And one of the classic integral criticisms about what they call green or postmodern or pluralistic is that it doesn't take its own position. They go, well, there's no hierarchies because it's all just your opinion and it's all just multiple perspectival contexts. But that's an absolutist, universal status superiority position to assert that. And unless you can accept that, you can't be at the position that you are at. And if you don't accept being in your position, it's just like if you accept that there's no boundaries, there's nothing against which you can be challenged, there's no solidity in any of this flux, then you can't take this flux to the next level. You just get trapped there endlessly, repeating little loops with each other and creating a largely degenerate social event. But what it could become, what is on the other side of relativity and plurality and intercontextuality, is the most amazing option human beings have ever had, to bring back antagonism as a position in which these multiple perspectives get closer. And this is what I would do, because when I've tried to think through what is the metaphysics necessary to support a so-called post-metaphysics, I come up with this notion of the metaphysics of adjacency. And one of the ways of thinking about it is the proximal interactive distance between perspectives or world spaces. Pluralism keeps them kind of apart, as if it's just a mysterious world of alternatives. Integral thinking, under any label by any thinker, it brings them much closer together, right? It pushes them up near each other. You feel that boundary tension again. These ones lock together. These are the interior perspectives. These are the exterior perspectives. These are the, formal operational perspectives. These are the pre-operational perspectives. It crunches it together. Now, I would argue there's even a further step where you go even closer and you get into a space where you can't quite tell what sameness and difference are anymore. And that's where it becomes non dualistic, so to speak. So, in my metaphysics of adjacency, there's a pluralistic mode, an integral mode, and then a non dual mode, but they're all the same thing. We're all looking at and building on the intercontextual space as the fundamental ontology, but you have to do it more intensely than the pluralists have been doing it. And to do that, to feel them closer together to the point where they organize each other, is like running into one of those antagonisms.
Yeah, so it's really helpful for me personally to better understand sort of where you're coming from. What you've called the metaphysics of adjacency. That's very helpful for me to situate that, and I like the way you're sort of emphasizing the fundamental ontology being this type of intersubjective space. What I would be interested in is as it relates to antagonism and let's say, what's the relationship? I guess what I'm trying to get at, what's the relationship between antagonism and developmental stages of the psyche? Because it seems to me like there must be some sort of art or some sort of emotional maturity that is necessary to be able to deal with certain antagonisms, and how do you know basically if you're taking on too big of a challenge or an antagonism that could, some antagonisms are literally life threatening. And some antagonisms are necessary for growth. And some antagonisms are simply a waste of time and you should just walk the other way. So I think maybe because of the ambiguity around the art of antagonism, there might be this tendency among postmodernist thinkers to try to get rid of it. And then on the other hand, and I would be interested if you do have any criticisms in this direction, is there a tendency within the integral space to also get rid of antagonism by becoming too integrated? Mm-hmm. So that's what I would ask to you.
Two parts to that. First one is the integration of aggression issue, right? So one of the main things we see in contemporary culture is a failure of people, and often males, to integrate the energy of aggression. And that failure to integrate can take a couple of different modes. One can be just the person who's always having aggressive outbursts for some stupid reason, right? They're ready to storm a building because of what they saw on Twitter. That's, what are they? They're not storing their aggression properly. They're not. The other group of people are the people who feel like they have no aggression, but they're constantly attacking anybody who represents aggression in their mind, right? And that's sort of the perverse so-called leftist position that we see in a lot of digital environments now. And so that inability to recognize that you are aggressive and to let that aggression be where it should be in your body and feel the way it feels, and also have some kind of discipline and strength to not necessarily engage in it, but also to see that it's okay to feel those things and that those things are not the fault of the person who reminded you of aggression. So all of that's part of basic health and maturity. But then we get up to this question of what's the sweet spot in the art of antagonism, right? And over this side is another guy very influenced by Nietzsche, who turned me onto a lot of this, was Aleister Crowley, right? Thelema is very much Nietzscheanism turned into a transcendental mystical philosophy. But that notion that Crowley brings in of love being the willful attempt to fuse with your opposite to create a polarized transformation that enables your growth and expansion is great. But it seems like he went way overboard, right? I'm going to merge with heroin. I'm going to merge. You don't want to merge with heroin. You don't want to merge with a gunshot. There's a lot of antagonisms that are too intense. They will ruin the structure. The Nassim Taleb thing. You can get anti-fragile by leaning into trauma, but only up to a certain point. Otherwise, it wrecks you and the game is over. The other side is not nearly enough antagonism. And you see that in let's say, the pluralists, and you see that in many of the integralists who are also coming into integralism from pluralism, right? And from a society where we are corporately trained to want to escape from antagonisms into self-rewarding product purchases and identification groups. But the problem with some integralism will be this notion that um, it's a very wonderful, open, positive space of all the perspectives, and we just affirm that they are all there and that they can be integrated, and that integration is going to make me feel just harmonized and wonderful, and this exact way I idealistically imagine all the saints of history feeling, just nice and open and helpful. Right now, there are things like that, right? You really do need to be a nicer, more open, more helpful person, and you really do need to integrate many perspectives. But
Yeah.
antagonism is in that mix, right? The perspectives you have to integrate are the ones that make you feel upset. The ones where you think that is the stupidest, most obnoxious, maybe most dangerous point of view I've ever heard. People can't be exposed to that point of view. It would be intrinsically awful. It makes me feel very upset. That's the other perspective you have to integrate. And that
Yeah.
integration proceeds not to a magical marshmallow of radiance in the sky. It proceeds to a much, yes, more joy. Yes, more beauty. Yes, the sense of coherence you get from integration. But it never removes the antagonism structure. It just finds
Exactly.
more and more skillful ways to plug it in and understand how it's used.
I think that is the point that at least I would like to stress is that, and I agree with the way you're framing this in general it is that yes, there is. I'm hesitant to say telos, but at the same time, there is a type of directionality. There is an expansion of joy and beauty and sense of coherence. But I think really whether it's on the side of using plurality to get rid of antagonism or the side of integration to get rid of antagonism, I do think that the psyche, which is set up in such a way as that it is either consciously or unconsciously trying to remove antagonism as such, I think that's the real transformation of perspective, which allows for a deepening of let's say the spiritual process. And I guess enough of, maybe I don't need to say too much about sort of like the knowledge forms I've experienced in that regard. But what I would like to do is maybe use this because I think we got a nice picture here of how perhaps Nietzsche relates to integral post-metaphysical worldview. Um, what I would like to touch on is your perspective on Zarathustra as a character, or Zarathustra as a mask, a narrative, a fictional vehicle, however you might relate to Zarathustra, because Zarathustra, it seems to me, is someone who's constantly playing with antagonism. We could go into each of the ways in which Zarathustra relates to different characters, perhaps especially in the fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what's your perspective on the character of Zarathustra?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously there are resonances with the foundational thinking of Zoroastrianism here, for sure. He's calling that back to some degree.
Shout out to Bard.
Shout out to Bard. Yeah. Nobody would care about Zoroastrianism if it wasn't for Bard.
And Nietzsche, apparently.
Yeah. Another way to think about it is as a purely spiritual event, right? Like Osho would say, if Nietzsche had been born in a culture with meditation training, he would be greater than Buddha, was one of Osho's comments. Right. So there's this question here about how the different cultural contexts are supporting this kind of a thinker, this kind of a consciousness agent, and also how they would interpret the story, right? Because if this was 17th century India, and you said, hey, this guy who spends a lot of time alone concentrating on the energy pattern that underlies all reality, trying to get deeper, this guy saw a subtle level entity appeared in him and told him a song story, and he wrote it down. They go, oh yeah, of course, there's subtle realm avatars, and they instruct you and can take you under their wing. Oh, we've got a whole system of that, right? So one way to think of Zarathustra really is something like a kind of guru for Nietzsche that bursts into his own consciousness because he can't find one in the world. And he accepts Zarathustra partly as a text he's writing, but partly as a revelatory participation, where he just wants to get this down because he's seeing a character who is satisfying all of his questions. He's been working with all these questions, book after book, ever since he was a kid. And now there's a guy who gets it and gets it better than him for some reason. So he has no choice but to become like a devotee of Zarathustra. So what kind of a guru is this? I think he's very consonant with a lot of what I call the tantric patriarchs of the 20th century, right? That there's, you got your Crowley, your Trungpa, your Da, your Osho, you got all these characters who are these, in a way, classic patriarchal figures of religiosity saying, hey, it's all going to be radically transformed now. It's going to be relational. It's going to be energetic. It's going to be dynamic. We don't have to use the old belief customs. So I see Zarathustra as like one of those guys, as if he was a famous 20th century Enlightenment cult leader who had some credibility. He's definitely been spending this time on his own trying to cause a buildup of his own empowerment and a coherent integration of his empowerment drives. And it succeeds. It succeeds as far as he can tell the same way all religious illumination experiments have succeeded when they've succeeded. And then he naturally feels like he has to gift people with this. And so that's a beautiful, right? He's a very charitable, he's a very generous character. He's very dynamic. He wants to get involved, but he's very self-critical and he learns from what happens as he goes. That didn't work. That didn't change people, right? I can't just hang out and say my wisdom to people. That's not what changes the world. And eventually he finds that even though he has some really good success in networks of people that have affinity for him, he still doesn't really know how to transform human beings. And he ends up spending much more time with adventurers and explorers, right? And he has this vision of the attempter philosophers of the future, which is essentially Nietzsche's vision too. There's some new kinds of thinkers coming. They will figure this out. They will be daring and experimental, and they will open the way for us to go beyond the cloud of the last man and find the lightning strike of the ultra-human and the folk that collaborate with the ultra-human. And that this transformation is possible, that it requires a return to embodiment, it requires a return to ecology, it requires a reaffirmation of what the yogis call the descending current, right? The downgoing experience of making the world be the site of the non-dual rather than projecting the non-dual into a non-world. And he's constantly in creative struggle and turmoil, interacting with his animals, his thoughts, pondering with himself, goes through these dreams I mentioned, right? The thing about the dream that he considers to be transformative, because he asks people to consider this dream he had that changed him, is the shepherd who he comes across and there's a snake down his mouth biting into his throat. How is he going to get out of this situation? This guy wakes up and there's a snake down his throat. Well, this guy bites the head of the snake off, keeping it biting his throat, spits the tail out, gets up laughing and moves on. This is the transformation in Zarathustra's vision. The antagonism remains. And you lean into it. And that's what sets it free and enables the overflow of the joy and the energy. Not because you escaped the antagonism, because you owned the antagonism. Right? And then that's where he can move on to this final sequence where he confronts the higher men that we probably want to discuss a little bit. Because the way I read it is, now Zarathustra's back, he holds a party, here come the higher men, they are examples of the best human beings throughout history, essentially, right? These are the great saints and the great leaders, the really deep people in all their different modes, right? Well, there's the ugly guy, which might even be Socrates, right? You're like, yeah, there's something wrong with each of them, but they are the deepest, best human beings of some kind, and they aren't enough. Your will now has to say the ultra-human possibility is coming. But what can we do with the higher men that we have? And he goes out of the party to ponder it. He's with his animals outside the cave, and he comes back in, and the ass festival has begun. It's like they're drunk. They're doing their little faux Satanist thing. They got a donkey up on the table. They've inverted all their values. And now, with humor and with obscenity and with some taboo breaking, he says basically this is the best we can do at the moment. If you can get humorists self-overcoming versions of the higher men of history, that's a good place to start. This is where we can pick this project up from. We're going to have to add in these new attempter philosophers. We're going to have to deal with the new cloud of meaninglessness that's coming. And on the other side of that, we have to be thinking embodied, ecological, ultra-human of some kind. So that's my take on Zarathustra as Sri Zarathustra, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot there. not even really sure where we should start with that one. But okay, so yes, okay. I like, well, what one thing that I really like about your perspective, and perhaps this is because you're coming from kind of, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but you call yourself a kind of anti-professor, or you've been called an anti-professor, it's sort of like an academic that's not an academic, or a scholar that's not a scholar type of thing. And for that reason, I think maybe where the traditional philosophical lineage, you'd say, okay, who was influenced by Nietzsche? You'd say Freud, Foucault, Heidegger. But you're emphasizing guys like Crowley, Trungpa, Osho, and I think it's very interesting to sort of see Zarathustra as a type of almost like an imagistic anticipation of figures like this. I guess my first question in this line is: are you a figure like this, or do you or do you think we need some, or is that 20th century sort of version of what Nietzsche's calling forth with Zarathustra? Is that still kind of what we need, or do we need yet another sort of metamorphoses of spirit into something quite more distributed, or perhaps something other?
I think there are phases that are ongoing in this process.
Yeah.
There are phases in our adaptation to the new technological and economic environments that are curious on the earth now, right? If we're entering into a connection-based light speed world, it's not going to happen overnight. You're going to get these, first wave, second wave, third wave, all that kind of stuff. So I see a period, which in my mind, I think of the age of the Tantric patriarchs, right? Like, so roughly the 20th century. And I think we're on the other side of that now. Now, they still have a role, but we see the people who are still trying to fulfill that role changing, taking more psychological and psychoanalytic and intersubjective mutual community things into consideration. They've got to be a little bit more up to date. I don't think we could really do this whole project with the quasi supermen of the 20th century. That was great. We need to learn from them. But when you watch what their lineages are doing, you watch all of their students, they're moving into this new interpersonal, connection-oriented, more psychologically and sociologically self-aware expanse, right? So for me, yeah, it's fun to say you're a guru, or it's fun to say, hey, I got a cult, or whatever it is. I don't think we should shy away from any of that stuff, but it's all in brackets now, right? And we're entering into this space where anybody who's playing with that in any degree, and it's not like I'm going around offering myself as the God man or anything, but I sometimes play some of those roles. But those roles have to be played a little differently even than they were in the 20th century, certainly than they were in the 1500s, right? You want challenge, you want some spiritual authority, you want these sorts of things, but it's got to be a lot more mutual, a lot more subjective, a lot more deconstructed and then reconstructed out of that, a lot more permeable than it's been before, even while we set some real boundaries about who can be in what space, right? And boundaries about what you have to surrender in yourself in order to touch the core of being, becoming. Nonetheless, it's very different flavor than those sorts of characters, I think.
Right. I think this is a super important topic, though, because, I think the main reason why is because if I was to pull out a central concept from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I think it would kind of be the notion of the Overman, or whatever we want to call it, the Ultraman, the Superman. What I'm taking from your perspective is, do we need to interpret the Overman in a more intersubjective, interpersonal frame than Nietzsche's doing in Thus Spoke Zarathustra? And I guess one of my questions both for myself and for the people who might be taking the course, would be, might that be an interesting way to read through the text in a type of critical way? Should we be rereading the concept of the overman in this way, or trying to at least? And that,
I think that should be woven in there as an option, as a very basic option, right? So we have this term transpersonal in English related to transpersonal psychology. But if you start to say, well, what is a trans person? And not just somebody who's able to alter their gender or their gender presentation, but somebody who is transpersonal as an agent, that their experience of themselves and of consciousness is the experience of a plurality, both inside and outside, that it's unsure whether this person is an individual or the voice of a community or the voice of something that permeates subjectivities from the outside, that kind of ambiguity, which points very much to some of the great spiritual characters, right? So if you take the self-confession of Franklin Jones, who later called himself Adi Da, right, and you bracket whatever concerns you might have about this character and just read his autobiography, The Knee of Listening, what you get is a story of a journey that transforms this individual, and then the next thing that happens is he, in his own confession, starts to be meditating other people, right? He sits down to do his practice, which he feels has already succeeded. He's already radically different now. His head's been cut off by Kali, right? And instead, what he's getting are the heads of other people. And so he's meditating them. And then he says some of them start to show up after a while. Now, there's a lot of metaphysical claim in a scenario like that we may or may not want to validate. But the basic idea of somebody who's moved in their consciousness to a place that's inhuman enough to accept other humans as being part of their own individual identity. The trans person is another way of saying the ultra human, the superman, the overmensch. So I think we need to think both from the point of view of my psyche is an internal plurality. I'm a individual. I'm also an interperson with others, and that the really capable intelligences of the future that we can play a role in generating are going to be these sort of interlinked trans persons. Somebody that hopefully has all the benefits that we used to associate with healthy individuality and all these new extraordinary, might as well be cosmic attributes.
one of the concepts I like the most in what you've just said is this being in touch. I think you said being in touch with something being in touch with something inhuman, to the point that you can accept other humans. And that's the sort of the concept that I think is interesting to reflect on in the way Nietzsche is talking about the overman or the superman, is that it's almost like he's bringing the inhuman from a godlike entity in a different world to some imminent process which is a part of our self-overcoming. Maybe it's maybe the easiest way to say it. And yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start with what you're describing in terms of the type of being that would be an interlinked trans person. But I have a temptation here, when the temptation is, and maybe this takes us too far afield, in which case we don't need to go into it. But the temptation is when we talk about interlinked trans persons in a spiritual context through deep meditation. And then you also mentioned we have this radically different technological, ecological environment in the 21st century, which is perhaps something that Nietzsche couldn't have even fathomed, as probably most philosophers before the 20th century couldn't have fathomed. And you have, let's say, just as an example, someone like Elon Musk doing the Neuralink thing, where you have these technologies which at least are described along the lines of linking us up brain to brain and stuff like that. And even what we're doing right now is kind of like, we're already kind of in the metaverse, and we're already kind of linking up beyond space and time and in weird ways. I mean, it actually isn't too much of a jump to say that, I've got this headset on my my ears right now, and all it takes is to go a little maybe inside, and then we anyway. So what I'm getting at is there anything in your view that justifies linking ideas along with the transhuman with the overman, what Nietzsche's talking about? Basically, this idea that what Nietzsche's talking about with the overman is somehow pointing towards something that we need to interpret in the modern technological environment as quasi-transhuman. And the link here is this weird way in which we need to think of ourselves as individuals and as trans interpersonal entities and so forth. Maybe this is too far afield, but I'd be interested to know just what your reaction is to this line of thinking.
Yeah, I would first want to make a distinction between the possibilities that transhumanism is pointing towards, which is for many people, the inevitable convergence of digital networks with the human brain network, and then hopefully also with biological networks in the Nietzschean sense, be true to the earth, oh my brother. So there is a convergence of the different kinds of network technologies, the internal network technology, the material network technology, the organic network technology. I think that is going to play a role, and there will be some radical possibilities available down that pathway that the transhumanists are pointing towards. But we have to be careful to distinguish that from the psychology that drives a lot of the transhumanist movement, which is often very adolescent, very anti-organic, very immature in terms of understanding the richness of human experience, right? So there's this, the fantasy element and the pathology of the transhumanists is a real thing, but we shouldn't get that confused with the very factual transformations of what it means to be a human being that are going forward, and the relationship between the individual multi-inner network nervous system with the multiple network ecosystem with the multiple network digital systems. At the very least, those three are going to grow together more tightly, and maybe a few other kinds of network processes that we don't know about yet properly. And they are going to create something that is extremely strange and uncanny, right? And this is one of the reasons. There's a famous letter where Nietzsche is talking to one of his women friends, one of the proto-feminists who he got along with really well for some reason. And he's trying to explain to this woman that when he says the ultra-human, when he says the trans person, yes, some of the things about Christ are in that, but it's as much Cesare Borgia as it is Christ. And one of the things he's saying, and there's a lot of ways you can say, well, why is Cesare Borgia coming in here? Why is he making the Buddha and Hannibal Lecter into the same character? And it's partly because virtue is functional. It's partly because self-awareness and a sense of evaluation outside of social constraints, all that stuff. But also he's saying it's going to be uncanny. It's going to feel dangerous. It's going to be weird. It's not just you come across Christ or some other bodhisattva and you think, this feels great. There's just so much loving kindness here. I'm absolutely on board, right? Because that corresponds to your current sense of your needs and what is human. But we're talking about something we haven't seen yet, something that will strike us as dangerous, as uncanny, as that classic sci-fi figure, when the eyes go black and you're like, oh my God, what am I seeing? The inhuman cosmos is now showing up in the form of a person. Right. So there's something about that. That's the antagonism, the cosmic antagonism we need to lean into, because you don't get the ultra human without the sense of the radically inhuman as a transition into that.
Yeah, I mean, great. Yeah, great point. I'm glad we touched on that as well, because I do think it's worth having these dialogues about thinking at the edges of transhumanist science, let's say, which is coming. I think you're correct to say that it is coming from a place of an adolescent and an immature perspective on human experience. But at the same time, I do think that a lot of philosophy and spirituality doesn't do enough time to engage in the radical novelty of the technological space that we're in. I mean, we're not in the 17th or the 15th century anymore, and the technologies that are coming are, that might be related to this leaning into something uncanny and different. And And I mean, I don't have answers here, but even though I've thought a lot about it, because it's to me it's just so complex. But I do think it's worth having throwing these things together and seeing what we can think at their intersections, especially when we have someone like, I mean, like you're coming from a very deep, rich spiritual tradition. Just to get your perspective on it. Another thing that I think we should definitely make time for in this conversation, which I have actually never even thought before. So I'm definitely very interested to hear what you have to say. Is in our personal conversation, you said that you wanted to touch on Nietzsche and big history, or Nietzsche's big history vision. Now, I think you've already touched a little bit on how in reading Nietzsche, he doesn't ever give you the full picture. He gives you, little bits, and almost doesn't on purpose give you the big picture. But I'd like you to maybe go into a little bit. What do you mean by Nietzsche and big history and Nietzsche's big picture?
Sure. Because we have philosophers who are more systematic, right? We have our Hegel's phenomenology of history, we have our spiral dynamics, we have our Ken Wilbers, right, and all of their analogs in the world, people who have told these now, like post-dynamic evolutionary thinking. We have a number of stories that go from the history of the Big Bang through these different stages of emergence up to life and consciousness and social beings and towards some next possibility. So we have these long, big stories of emergent regimes now. And we often don't think about Nietzsche in that way, but you can piece together what he says in terms of putting that story together, especially if you've read through the notebooks a few times. You get a sense, because what he puts in the notebooks, he leaves out a lot of that stuff in the books because he's deliberately trying to package it in a certain way. So we go, well, what's the story here? What is this guy's cosmology? You go, well, in the beginning, of course, there was no beginning. We're dealing with endless time in this guy's thinking. Now, we could do a side adjunct on like my shamanic take on what the eternal recurrence means. But basically, we're saying there's no beginning, right? Yeah. There's no beginning, but there is fundamental structures that are energy-like when we look at them from the outside and will to power-like when we look at them from the inside. So there's this fundamental pattern of like, what does energy do at its most basic level? What is the first structure of dynamism that everything else is built out of? So this moment of energy, this energy event that he's thinking, right, where potentials are drawn together, converged, integrated to the point where they can express themselves as a temporary singularity in relationship. They discharge, overcoming themselves, and they have some kind of relational interaction that causes an effect in terms of restructuring and reinterpreting the rest of all the other charges that are doing the same thing. So the will to power, or the will to empowerment at its most basic level, is this correlate to the basic change of energy, right? What happens when energy discharges, when it moves or transforms? And what is the subjectivity of that like? It's an urge to do that very thing. So now you have that as the fundamental self-overcoming energetic discharge that produces a feeling of empowerment that turns the becoming into a momentarily eternalized intensity of beingness. So that's what we're starting with. Those are the atoms of his universe. And when they hold each other in check and then collectively discharge, the intensity of that experience is increased. Right? And this will tell us something later when we get to objectivity, which is certain drives hold other drives in check. And like a person pressing against two walls, they can kind of suspend themselves in the air now because of these two contradictory forms of this same primal urgency. So this system is causing these mergers of these will to power event discharges. And these mergers are creating more intense discharges, and that becomes the teleological like, the orientational unfolding of reality is toward progressively mutually bound intensities of discharge. So increases of the will to power, that's the orientation of the cosmos. And this is building up. It builds up into the form of atoms and molecules and worlds. It builds up into the form of the biological regimes. And then it builds up into the form of these sociological regimes. So now you've got, let's say, human persons. If we just skip over all these different increases of potency that were possible through evolutionary history, now you have the human animal. And the human animal is become extremely complex. And so it can, under ideal conditions, organize that complexity into a much more intense discharge. Its sense of beingness that it gets through the empowerment gesture is more intense than its predecessors. But because it's so complex, it's easily scrambled. And so when human beings collide with each other and collide with nature, they get scrambled a lot. They get traumatized. Their ability to organize and coordinate their instincts is disrupted. So that we see, that's how I always put it. If you get 100 jaguars together, 98 of them are pretty good. You're like, that guy's pulling off being a jaguar. Great. If you get 100 human beings together, there's a lot of them who aren't pulling it off very well, who aren't getting that level of coordination that we see in the jaguar and almost deify when we behold it as this overflowing naturalness that we love so much. So the human beings are colliding with each other and colliding with nature, and now you're getting a stratification of some kind, right? You're getting the people who, by fortunate circumstance, basically, have a lot of their instincts intact and harmonized, and those who have a lot of their instincts screwed up. And especially when two tribes collide, and the mythological image is one of them takes them over as slaves, because we're more confident, we're more coordinated, we're more organized, we feel better about ourselves, we have more of our biological energies with us, we're more likely to defeat you. And now you are the underclass in our system. And now you get the conditions for what he calls the slave revolt in history. Because these, the people who have been less disturbed by the human experience, they have more of that overflowing magisterial reality where its value is just to be me. Value is good. The fact that we are us, that's the valuable thing. To be good is to be like us. And I will name the world and I will consecrate things. I will give them of my extra value that I'm producing magical status. Fantastic. And then you have this underclass that desperately wants to get its mojo back, right? And it has no choice. It has to strive for that. And what it does is, in that struggle, reinterprets the qualities of its masters. Its rivals are interpreted as oppressors, and their positive qualities get mixed in with their negative qualities. So now their ability to be grandiose and strong and anti-fragile and overwhelming, that's all taken as demonic, as negative by the underclass, as it would have to be, because they want to put those people down to help themselves rise up and regain their potency. And if you leave it run long enough, they almost always will succeed. You can't keep the slaves down inevitably because they want to express the will to power. They are learning new virtues like covert coordination, and they're simmering with an undischarged rage against the people who are keeping them from their full self-expression, and they will keep trying. So eventually you get these turnovers. He points to the Jewish escape from Egypt as one of the fundamental examples of this pattern. So that now you have a new people, they're reestablishing their ability to coordinate their instincts together to have a power discharge that they think of as religion, as a god like us, as the self-apotheosis of a people that becomes possible when they are healthy and coordinated. But built into that process are a bunch of negative anti-life evaluations that come from viewing the masters as bad. So some of the positive, healthy things about the masters are now viewed as demonic, and they are pushed down. So these people now have a struggle inside between their attempt to liberate themselves as flows of empowerment and their attempt to demonize some of the roots that our empowerment and our energy flow require. And so then that moves forward into all the major Western monotheisms, Christianity takes over, emerges with the Roman Empire, and you get a normative culture of Neoplatonism or Neoplatonic Christianity, in which the negative valuations of the positive life sources of how we increase our feeling of value it is dispersed everywhere as problematic, right? And that's exemplified in the way Nietzsche thinks about the Platonic Aristotelian contribution that sometimes he heaps on Socrates as being the source. Uh, that there's another world that's better, right? That all the good things are somewhere else. That this world of insufficiency and matter and bodies is somehow a thing to devalue. And so you end up in this situation where God, the Christian God, the post-Platonic God, the most valuable thing is imagined to exist in a place where it can't possibly exist, right? And that's the epitome of this downstream post-Roman Empire, post-Judaic, post-Christian experience of civilization that's contaminated by these reversed values. They build up into the worship of priestly characters who exhibit none of the healthy overflow. And it's exemplified in this figure of a God who exists outside of or before. If he's the creator of reality, he exists before reality. But to be outside or before reality is to be technically unreal. And therefore, the most valuable thing is placed into unreality. Just like the most valuable thing about life is placed into death. Death is where you're going to get all the experiences you should have. You're like, that's a very perverse situation, right? So that Nietzsche says you can't run it like that. That system will destroy itself. Those highest values will devalue themselves because you can't get value production as flows of organized empowerment. You can't get that if you're sawing off the roots of the sources of energy that have to contribute to that organized flow. So it will eventually destroy itself. And this pattern is very ubiquitous. The nihilists in general don't recognize themselves. They think they are idealistic believers, believers in Christ, believers in Allah, believers in science, right? They think they're positive, but the form of their positivity is structured in a way that makes nothingness into the best possible thing. So there's this perverse nihilistic underbelly to this whole system. And it starts to collapse. It starts to break down, especially when it's exposed to the conditions that are accelerated in modernity. So now we're up to this place where we're running a system that is in service of some kind of economic and power model, which extends out of the Christian idea of truth and individuality and equality before God. But it's not solved the problems of the nihilism that was inherent in those monotheisms. It's only accelerated it and made it harder for us to think about. So you get up to the level where the madman in Nietzsche's example is not saying there's no God. He's making fun of the modern people. He's making fun of the atheists for thinking that they've solved the problem. He says, you've killed God, but you haven't even begun to smell the decaying body, right? You have no idea what it means to not be a believer. You are still a believer. Just because you drive a car and work in a factory now doesn't mean your wisdom and value have been elevated. You're still caught in the nihilistic sphere. And also, he says that about the egalitarian progressives, right? He's not necessarily against all of their proposals, but he's saying you're coming at this from the wrong angle. You're not thinking about how we really free ourselves from the underlying sabotage of the power buildup impulse that is the goal of the entire evolutionary history of the cosmos and that we have to participate in. So that now we have to, knowing this, we cross a threshold. This is the great noon. Yeah, the system recognizes itself as an evolutionary power flow maximizing process. What is it going to do then? How is it going to get to more individual and more distributed intensities of empowerment? It's going to have to go through the cloud of nihilism and of the last man and of all these trends we're inheriting. So we now have to prepare to go through the meaning crisis in order to reorganize ourselves on the other side. And what we need for that is some way to secure the well-being of most of the people, some way to move to a new planetary politics that he keeps calling for, and some way to raise crops of new experimental philosophers who can figure out the pathways that lead to the ultra-human. So that gets us roughly up to date from the beginning of the universe till now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, Layman Pascal is in. Yeah, take a drink. You want to take another drink? Just go ahead. I'm really glad I asked you about Nietzsche's big history. that was really great. So yeah, for anyone who didn't catch that the first time, rewind. Not sure if. Well, I'd have to like pause for a moment to think about what question I want to ask, because I'm a little bit overwhelmed. But okay, so if I'm regrouping, so the two concepts in Nietzsche's big history, it seems that you're working with, which I think Deleuze also works with, is the notion of the eternal return and the will to power. And I think, I mean, you've just done a fantastic job there of starting with sort of this beginning, which is not a beginning, and this will to power from the inside, which where Nietzsche's what we're dealing with here with Nietzsche are these basic elements of the universe as this energy of constant self overcoming and stuff. And the question, or the idea I had in my mind when you were starting to give us this big history, was that I would like to hold you to describing perhaps what your view on the eternal recurrence is, because I think what we got here, which again, if people need to listen to that again, I think listen to that again. But what we got there was like a quasi-teleological will to power, which can be used in a way to explain the situation for the human animal, which is the highest level of complexity and intensity of that will to power, and that it's extraordinarily difficult for us to be our highest versions of ourselves. Whereas, for example, you gave the example where I thought this was really nice, where you gave the example where it's really easy for jaguars to be jaguars, but if you get 100 people together, it's really hard for 100 people to be the best versions of themselves that they can be. And we can fall into basically these master-slave mythological complexes where we get all our instincts screwed up. And I think that's really interesting to analyze. But yeah, what if I could hold you to this? Where do you think the eternal recurrence falls into this cosmology? Because the overman and this idea that the human being has this will to power, this increasing of intensity and this increasing of power flows, seems to give a type of telos to the universe. But the eternal recurrence gives a type of, I want to say, cyclical view to the universe. And I know there are some people in cosmology who have interpreted it that way. What would be your, how do you square this circle?
Yeah, you got to run those against each other and let them grow together, I think. Right? There's a very integral theory, and its cousins are full of people who want to tell a great story about the ongoing evolutionary intensification of value, which is great. But what Nietzsche gives us is that thing you're talking about, value, is not the alternative to all the negative things, right? That's an extension of one duck raping another, right? That the underlying drive is common at all the levels, and these new things, the things we call the good, when they are legitimately and healthily good, we should be pursuing them. But that doesn't put us in opposition to any villainy in history. It's an extension of that process. So it's really beautiful how he puts everybody on the same page there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Now, there is something like a telos to that, right? That there's an urgency to those drives, and that over time they will go in a certain direction. That direction may roughly approximate a Teilhard de Chardin direction of increasing human depth and increasing external complexity of organization. Okay, but that's not a beautiful fantasy. That's an intensity of the power drive. Now,
are we going to get the omega point of the noosphere?
Yeah. Yeah, it's as much it's as much you beholding the wonderfulness of God as it is God punching you. Right? There's a dark side to the omega, and the omega is never finally achieved. It's a direction. It's like the horizon, but there is a horizon. There is a directionality. It's just not as nice as we sometimes think it is, but it does explain all the things that we do think are nice and benevolent that we actually should be working on. We just have to take the dark side into account. Now, the eternal recurrence, there's a cyclical element to it for sure. I think for me, the first ways I thought about eternal recurrence were as, like he says, a test to see if you can tolerate the actual conditions of your life, because the formula for greatness is amor fati, to say if ever it was that I willed it thus, to get my intentionality up to speed in the present moment so that it can move forward. And that means to say, everything I've lived through and everything that I'm living through right now, to say yes to it, right? So the first level of the eternal recurrence is the test, the filter, right? He wants an idea that will make it harder for unhealthy people and make healthy people stronger. And the test is, could you accept the endless experience of every little piece of your life? Or would that drive you mad? Right? So there's that test element. Can you bring your affirmation? Can you bring your will up to speed with your whole history and everything that happens? Great. Then there's the second element, which is when you're thinking about that, let's say, membrane that separates us from the transhuman. That is also a membrane where time is perceived very differently. And it might be that you perceive each event happening endlessly. It might be something like, the way multi-worlds are thought about in quantum physics now, that whatever you do, you also did every other thing and did them endlessly. There's an expansion of time that is daunting, that provides a threshold that feels so inhuman. Seems like we can't possibly process that or make sense of it. And that's part of the challenge to grow into, to let our hearts and our minds open to an impossible endlessness of time in some direction. So those are where I start as a kid thinking about Nietzsche. But where I am now is that I would phrase it slightly differently. To me, the eternal recurrence. Yep.
Let me just say, Layman Pascal was not an ordinary kid. It's like, hey, Jimmy, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking about lunch. hey,
let me tweak that slightly. Maybe I was the only ordinary kid,
okay,
and everybody else was some kind of pathological deviant.
Okay. Go on.
Okay. Indefinite extension is another way to say, a stranger way to say the eternal recurrence. And this came to me actually in my one ceremonial ayahuasca experience, was a sense of these ancient shamans trying to tell me something that I was thinking of as the eternal recurrence, and they wanted to tweak it a little bit. And the idea was that there is a way of being in time, a way of becoming, a tempo of becoming that sacralizes experience, and that it is to move as though there were indefinite, which is to say eternal, but without thinking you're the boss of what infinity means, indefinite extension of anything. So the original shaman is going to place a consecrated object in a concentrated spot, right? This is the feather. You put it there. You move as though each thing you were doing was echoing endlessly. There was indefinite extension through time. And now you have a certain kind of timing that goes along with that. And that timing is what helps to produce sacralization, to produce coordination, to produce overflow. Something a little bit like if you watch people even pretending to do Tai Chi, right? They're slowing down their movements, but not too slow. They're trying to go for some kind of tempo we almost instinctively know about. And that the eternal recurrence is a way of suggesting a mode of activity in time that is timed to have indefinite extension as its context, which is designed to empower us to be creators of value, to be sacralizers of experience.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Um, so in that okay. So in that perspective, I think we're talking about a type of, I mean, well, the notion that's coming to my mind is a type of shamanistic Nietzsche. What, if anything, does that have to do, just coming to my mind right now, what, if anything, does that have to do with these notions of a type of universal shamanism? So the idea I want to frame here is that in the beginnings, quote unquote, of the human species, there's this idea that all hunter-gatherer tribes would have a type of, and this is from Bard's Nomadology. So in Bard's Nomadology, you don't really have humans, you have men and women, and then you have the shamanoid androgynous class. So there's this type of universal shamanism that's in a nomadological frame, and then so the shamans would sort of be the leaders of the tribe. And then the idea that I'm having in my head now is that with this sort of shamanistic interpretation of Nietzsche and the eternal return of the same, would be that in the deconstruction of religion, in the deconstruction of metaphysics, certainly in the Western context, is it perhaps pointing towards some sort of universal shamanism? And does that jive with what you're trying to go for with the type of integral post-metaphysical spirituality? I'm just trying to make some connections, but that's what's coming to my head here.
Sure, that's a very reasonable way to put it. I mean, the simplification of the decentralized power structure of nomadic tribes does give us something like matriarchs, patriarchs, and shamans, right? That they were all involved in the collective intelligence and the structuring and the orchestrating of a healthy society. And now we're in a situation that may be very similar in terms of our need to generate new tribes that inhabit our new world moment. And we need to, be aware of the maturational capacities that are necessary to produce healthy patriarchs, healthy matriarchs, healthy tribes, healthy children, and a healthy shamanic caste. And the healthy shamanic caste is, in some senses, separated from the tribe. They're in the borderlands, interfacing between the tribe and the ecology, between the tribe and other tribes, between the tribe and other modes of cognition and experience. But there's also an element in which the shaman plays a role in the tribe, helping to orchestrate ordeals, helping to orchestrate cultivational education, and I think probably in the contemporary world, spreading some subset of the shamanic skills to everyone in general. So there are some blurred areas where the shaman can come back and act as a helper, and not everybody needs to be the shaman, and not everybody should even think they can be the shaman. But there are some aspects of shamanism that are needed in general by people, and also especially by people going forward at the moment. So there is a way in which we could think of a shamanic caste as being a privileged, esoteric, universalist component of the emerging world space that has a special role in tending the emergence of decentralized tribes, but also the tribe that consists of new digital humanity in general. So I think Nietzsche is pointing to something like that. And one of the reasons we would call that shamanic, as opposed to calling it anything else, we could call it a wizard or a warlock or a priest or a saint or whatever we wanted. But the reason to call it shamanic is A, that tribal poiesis is necessary, B, that embodiment and ecology have to be at the center of anybody's spirituality now, and C, that altered states have to be taken over as a technology. And I would add sort of D as well, which is this art of creating new culture, of creating new sacralization that we associate with the so-called primitive spiritual mutants of our species. That's important now, right? Some people will be able to take over existing traditions and find their participation in the new world through that. But we also need to be generating new traditions. We need to be improvising new forms of sacred technology so that we can generate new tribes going forward. And my sense is that we will be looked back on as the ancestor progenitors of a whole new civilization, so that we are in the position of the sources of cultural lineage, not necessarily in the position of the inheritors anymore. That we have to connect with our ancestor, we have to connect with the world, but we have to be the ones who are making it up in a way, so that people of the future will look back and go, oh yeah, those people we aren't really sure of who started all of our new lineages, that's who we are now. So shamanism is very pertinent to this moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, and we're certainly at some sort of qualitative transformation. We're undergoing some sort of qualitative transformation where it's not merely a quantitative buildup, but that there's a birth of a time between worlds, as Zach Stein has said, and that might be a good segue for perhaps a last question to at least. Close at least a point towards a closing out of the conversation, which would be, and I think this actually nicely transitions. If you could give some sort of commentary or some sort of reflection on, in the context of this conversation, the work you do with the liminal web, the idea. I mean, you're a theorist of the liminal web, but I think that's a concept that you've had some degree of importance in theorizing and bringing to the forefront, which is very much sort of like this, I think, broad intellectual community of digital creators who are, not necessarily working within the traditional institutions, but are nonetheless trying to think, I think, about birthing these new lineages that you're speaking to. And then on the other hand, and then that's the virtual dimension. And then also the physical dimension and the embodied dimension, because I know you're also doing work with a project called Ontario Depth Adaptation, where you're talking about, really on the ground. I know I've been in some email communications about that. You're really talking about on the ground stuff, and maybe the interconnection between these two things.
Yeah, there's some connections to Nietzschean thought there for sure. I think one way to conceive of the liminal web, or I've been writing it x.liminal.web in my notes lately, because the x liminal web means, first of all, we're always moving on from terminology, and we'll probably call ourselves something different shortly. So it's the x liminal web in that sense, but also it's the extended liminal web. So it's not just the overlapping, what I call cousin communities of developmental meta thinkers of various kinds that we know about right now. It's also the ones we don't know about. It's also the ones who are out there in the world that we don't hear from. And it's also the people who are about to come into this today or tomorrow or 5 years from now. So there's a sense in which there is an intertribal ethos of overlapping, not completely homogenous, but highly similar groups, in which lots of people are members or participants in multiple aspects of this community. And that these are, in a way, or we should at least think of ourselves as, being the people for whom Nietzsche was writing, right? The post-pluralists, the trans-nihilists, the people who are trying to go, yeah, you're right, it's multi-perspectival, it's evolutionary, it's outside of conventional morality, it's all of those things. We accept that. How can we try to put that together in some way? And there'll be lots of different styles and lots of different moves and lots of different room for criticism and support between these people. But there's a plausible argument that this emergent collection of internetwork people is the audience he was writing for that did not exist in 1870, right? These new philosophers he saw coming up over the horizon, these attempters, these people who get what it's like to jump between perspectives and don't experience that as a proof that there's no meaning, that they experience it as something you would inherently have to build into the new structure of meaning, whose empowerment capacity is going to exceed anything we've seen before, and we volunteer to be participants in that. So that's a way of thinking about the liminal web in connection with Nietzsche as being his prophesized audience. And I think it's empowering for these communities to at least accept that as a possibility of saying, hey, maybe we are that. Let's get together on this. The Ontario Depth Adaptation Project, and when I come back from Austin at the end of the month, we'll be in Southern Ontario on the 27th and the 28th, trying to see who wants to come in person to talk about this. So anybody who wants to contact me at Layman Pascal at Gmail or any other way, we're happy to have anybody be involved if they like. But the idea is basically to be true to the earth, as Zarathustra says, right? That we need to be more bioregional, we need to be more practical, we need to be more real community, real earth, and we need to be more preparatory for inevitable social destabilizations than we've been so far. And if we can bring together people whose orientation is to be setting up community networks, to be setting up food production systems, to be setting up new kinds of educational facilities, to be doing agriculture in new ways, to be generating power in new ways, right? Those sort of what we might generally call preppers, bring them together with what we might generally call meta thinkers, because the preppers don't necessarily have the right vision and they're not necessarily focusing on the right things. The meta thinkers have the vision, know what the values are, understand how the emerging world kind of looks or has to look, but they're not putting a lot of their time and energy into figuring out who they actually live near. And if the borders went down or the internet went down or the bombs started going off or the supply chain was disrupted, who would you want to link with? Who would you want to be in your bubble, in your pod, in your bunker, right? We need to be getting a collection, but like liminal preppers in a way. And that's going to be, I call it amphibious apocalyptarianism. So it's amphibious because you're living simultaneously in two worlds. One world is, what is the world like when things are not collapsing? And the other one is, what does the world look like when it's collapsing? When one of the inevitable disruptions is going to happen. We don't know which one or when. That's going to happen. We have to build in a way that satisfies both, right? So how do you build, say, education or a power system for a real community in a way that helps them now, but also specially helps them when things go wrong, and specially favors the types of thinking and vision and characters that we wish to have be more represented in any future, especially any reconstruction of civilization that might happen. So we're just at the beginning of that process. It's an enormously important question. Nobody's got the answers. The basic things we can do right now is start to get together and presence these questions together. And we're going to try to do that in Acton in Southern Ontario on the 27th and 28th. So anybody who's interested, that's an open space.
All right. That's amazing. Well, Layman, I think this is a good place to end. I'll just sort of
I've got maybe one more thought I'd throw into that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I was going to let you close that anyway.
Go ahead. Do whatever.
Oh, but I was just gonna say just to sort of recapitulate for the viewers that we're talking about here, Layman Pascal's Nietzsche, and I think we had a fantastic chance to talk about, I think, all the major points we really wanted to touch on, namely sort of how to read Nietzsche. I specifically spent a lot of time as Nietzsche as an integral post-metaphysical spirit, or the relation, let's say, between Nietzsche and integral post-metaphysical spirituality. The perspective on Zarathustra, I think probably the highlight for me, which I'm going to go back and rewatch perhaps this weekend, was your perspective on Nietzsche's big history, which was a lot to take in. It was really, really phenomenal. And also a little bit of Nietzsche and the eternal return, pointing towards shamanism and stuff like this, and then a little bit at the end about the liminal web and the Ontario Depth Adaptation, and this is a part of a larger conversation series called the Nietzsche Dialogues, which is all in preparation for a course on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is going to be starting July 15th, 2022. We're going to be spending the summer basically meditating on the cracks and the intricacies and the complexities of Nietzsche's thought in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's the second course I'll be leading through Philosophy Portal. So if you're interested in that, there'll be a link in the description. And you can contact me if you have any questions or concerns or comments about the nature of the course and what we'll be aiming to achieve there. But I'll pass it back to you, Layman. Anything you want to say, anything you want to add?
Let me throw in a little framing stuff first. That's great. I'm looking forward to your courses. People can check out my Substack where I answer questions that people have sent in. They can follow Integral Stage on YouTube or various audio podcasts. They can stalk me on Facebook. If you're coming to the Emerge conference in Austin, give me a hug. Visit us outside Toronto on the 27th, 28th, 29th. Come to the next Metamodern Spirituality Retreat. It's probably going to be in October on goodness in the metamodern sense. And I'll probably be doing another Parallax Rebuilding Spirituality course in September around trying to focus on the inner and intersubjective practices appropriate to the network age. But one thing that I noticed we really didn't touch on was Dionysus, which is a huge aspect of Nietzsche taken in a spiritual sense. So we did touch on this apocalypse thing, and the apocalypse thing is interesting because Nietzsche is a huge proponent of what he calls tragic wisdom, which he first associates with the Greeks and later claims to have discovered or invented himself, right? And we're looking a lot at how we are post-doomers, how we can be post-tragic now. And he's looking originally in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, of how it was that these non-optimistic people, these really tragedy-oriented people whose every public story is the failure of their protagonist, and they even force each other to watch these things, how these people generated so much world historical energy. And we need to take that seriously and not think that it's a problem of we're in a bad mood about the apocalypse and we just have to get positive because optimism is a self-reinforcing philosophy. There's a little bit of truth to that. But we have to go down. We have to descend back into the body, back into the earth, back into the broken heart and the muck that the tree roots reach into so that it can grow large. We have to be prepared for a tragic world and to feel like the world is an apocalyptic failure so that we can start to show up more completely. That pessimism is not a failure to engage. It's something you have to be emotionally capable of processing so that you can become the maximum participant for your world moment. And part of that is based on these Dionysian thoughts, which at the beginning of Nietzsche's thinking is originally a kind of duality between Apollo and Dionysus. You find this spelled out in the first book. And for a lot of people, that's the main takeaway from Nietzsche is, oh, the Apollo and Dionysus guy. Because it is important to think about different strategies for transfiguring reality. One strategy is to make it really nice, make the scene good. That's the Apollonian strategy. The other one is to let it all go and just merge and blend with the insufficiency of things. That's the Dionysian strategy. But at the beginning of his work, these are seen as two opposing forces. And by the end of his work, they have been absorbed together because thinking of Dionysus the philosopher, he sometimes says, right? He's talking about a structured version of Dionysus. Even as we conceptualize it, we are merging it with the Apollonian. So when we think Dionysus, we're already in some sense thinking of the Apollonian and the Dionysian connected. And this is the God to whom Nietzsche is explicitly devoting his work, right? We shouldn't overlook him as a pious character relative to this new spirit, this new mood that he points to as Dionysus, that at the end of Beyond Good and Evil, he writes this beautiful passage about his dialogical interactions with Dionysus to let you know what he's like. This tempter, this seducer, this malicious, charming entity that always wants you to be more of your light and your dark self, to always find the nuances, to feel your way forward, to grow into the world more, right? This is the Dionysus that he proposes as the alternative to the crucified notion of the higher self. And this Dionysus, one of the things that always stood out to me is that the Greeks would call him Dionysus dendritis, right? The dendrites, they're branches. The Dio of Nisus, the spirit of the forest, the spirit of nature, the god of the branching of nature, the branching of wisdom, the growth into new possibilities and new nuances, that this is the mood of the naturalistic spirit that he proposes as the divine transfiguration of a world going forward that we can actually get behind. So I think we should take his piety toward Dionysus really seriously.
Well, another great riff there. Well, I specifically like the way you're articulating that if we view Apollo and Dionysus as separate and hit them setting these two figures in some sort of duality with each other, that we're missing something that goes a little deeper, which is the relation and the interconnection between the two, right? And I think that again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that he might say that the Christian society and the Christian culture is probably too much Apollo and not enough Dionysus, and that they've severed themselves from their roots, so to speak, that they can't feel into their Dionysian spirit, and that they've crucified themselves on the Apollonian cross or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And Dionysus is this possibility that we retake possession of our negative and our positive together, that we escape from the nihilism that is forced upon us by the particular types of antagonism between positive and negative that we haven't been able to process or accept, that we bring everything back into a single frame, whether it's our virtues and our disreputable animalistic ancestors, or whether it's the highest value being in the world rather than outside of the world, which we can't think. So Dionysus is all of that return of the intensity of value and value production back into the given world in a way that exceeds, that spills over, that regenerates that image of the self overcoming back into the world. And that Dionysus is a way of us taking that all on board, taking the multiplicity and the antagonism on board as the necessary precondition for a step into a much more intense, much more coherent, much more integrated, much more valuable feeling world that is possible on the other side of the dark cloud of the meaning crisis.
I think this is extremely, I mean, to me, I and in the context of this conversation as well, and while I've been building the course, for me, engaging someone like Nietzsche is absolutely essential in our various loosely connected internet communities that are somehow organized by, I think, a type of negativity in the sense of the meaning crisis, or I mean, when Nietzsche talks about the transvaluation and values and the confrontation of modern nihilism, I mean, I think this is a philosopher that can really help us interpretively in these modern spaces. So I think he is a philosopher that has so much to offer us still in the 21st century. And Layman, as a guest here, I've learned so much. So I think you've also helped me prepare so much for this course, and given me, I think, a much richer view on Nietzsche. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, there's a lot more I could say, but this is a fabulous discussion to hold. I'm looking forward to your course, and again, I want to say I think you're one of the real thinkers of the moment.
Thanks, man. That I mean, coming from you, that really does mean a lot. I really appreciate the work you've done. So anyone watching, links to Layman's Substack, which is awesome, and the Integral Stage and the work you do with Bruce Alderman is also fantastic. So for everyone who's been listening, you've had 2+ hours of Nietzsche and Layman Pascal. Can't get much better than that.
Cheers.
Peace out.